notification that I received about the increased activity near the Kola Peninsula in the Murmansk area and the Northern Fleet bases was because I wondered whether or not anyone in Norway is aware of what's happening, because Norway is very much in the line of fire if any of this should turn into something serious, which is not impossible at this stage. So I'm curious right off the bat before we go any further, is anyone in Norway paying attention to this?
Not as I, no, not according to what I'm seeing at least.
Well, I think we have to go back to even before the Alaska meeting, which turned out to be largely a nothing burger, as we say. Then we've got to go back and listen to these remarks that were made by Lieutenant General Donahue back in June that ultimately came to light in July. He was the commander of U.S. Army ground forces in Europe, a light infantryman and someone with a career that was largely in special operations. And he talked about the fact that, quote unquote, forces under his command could take Kaliningrad, the part of East Prussia that Russia kept after the Second World War, which is now sovereign Russian territory, in a few hours. That this place, which is not only a naval base and a production facility for naval vessels and equipment, but also a major hub for Russian military capabilities, especially in terms of rockets, missiles, strike, and air and missile defense. This is not something that we should take lightly, and the fact that he would go public and make such a statement really shocked me and many others, because normally, senior officers do not make statements like that in public. In fact, that's the last thing you would want them to do. But what I'm seeing now is basically a pattern. And I think that he was saying things that I think both President Trump and probably Secretary Hegseth welcomed. I think that we are locked into this notion that bullying tactics will work, that you can bully or intimidate Moscow or Beijing or Tehran or anybody else, or for that matter, New Delhi, to doing whatever it is that you want them to do. I think it's very dangerous. And what I read this morning that struck me was not that it's the first time that we've had a lot of aircraft flying on the periphery of the Russian air defense identification zone. We've also got a lot of vessels carrying Tomahawk missiles, as you pointed out, not only Navy, but also Norwegian, and that they're moving towards Novaya Zemlya, which is very unusual. It's up on the Arctic. And then you also had a B-2A bomber fly a route to Norway and back to the United States in the middle of all of this. And somebody said, well, this is because of the upcoming Zapad 2025 exercise that the Russians schedule years in advance. Everyone's notified, knows it's coming. I don't think that's really true. I think what we're seeing right now is an attempt to bully by practicing strikes on Russian facilities using bombers and missile carriers. And as you just pointed out, practicing for the purpose of attacking Russian submarines. All of this, I think, in the minds of President Trump, the Secretary of Defense, and probably the Secretary of State Rubio, is designed to frighten or intimidate Moscow into doing whatever we think we want them to do in Ukraine. And of course, I don't see any evidence that that will do the trick. On the contrary, I think it's much more likely to really provoke the Russians, and you end up in a very tense environment where the slightest mistake could result in a confrontation that, truthfully, I don't think anybody wants. And of course, you have to look at this against the backdrop of the preparations down in the Caribbean for what people think will be a regime change attempt down in Venezuela. So the world, it seems to be being pushed by Washington and its allies into some sort of confrontation with Russia and anybody else that we determine we don't like, such as Maduro in Venezuela.
Well, the context is quite important because for Russia, its whole history has been the struggle to acquire reliable access to waterways. And it has three oceans on its western borders, the Arctic, Baltic, and the Black Sea. Now, It's I guess it's no secret that the key objective in this Ukraine war was to make the Black Sea a NATO lake. Well, in the Baltic Sea, though, you have the Poland, the Baltic states arguing that the Baltic Sea is now a NATO lake since Sweden and Finland joined. You also have the former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen arguing that we could now put a blockade on St. Petersburg if we choose, given that we now have Finland and Sweden in. A while ago, you had Financial Times publishing an article that Denmark could block Russian oil tankers from reaching markets in the Baltic Sea. And of course, the last sea, the Arctic, is also now becoming a bit more militarized with more US bases across Scandinavia. But but there's been a lot of reports as well about Finland, Lapland, that the Russians might attack it, which just happens to be up north next to the Russian Northern Fleet, which suggests that out of allegedly defensive motivations, we're now going to militarize that region close to the Northern Fleet as well. But how this is something you might expect, though, if we're losing a war in Ukraine, the economic pressures on the rest of the world isn't working. Isn't this just another step up the escalation ladder?
Well, it certainly looks that way. The question is, if you're losing a war and there's absolutely no evidence that anything you can do will change that outcome, why would you take such irrational steps? Now, we know you pointed out something just a second ago. If you go back and look at Crimea, when the Russians opted to seize it very suddenly and very quickly, what people didn't know is that there were great plans in NATO to occupy Crimea, to use the naval facilities there for the very purpose that you outlined, to turn the Black Sea into a NATO lake, if you will. That didn't work because the Russians preempted us. And of course, the Ukrainians had made themselves rather unpopular in Crimea with both the Tatars that lived there, as well as with the Russians. So they had plenty of support for the population there. But the bottom line is that we've unambiguously failed in Ukraine. There's an unwillingness to admit this truth. And if we persist in provoking, as we are doing right now and have been doing for months, frankly, we will eventually get a reaction. And we may not like that reaction. Because let's be frank, we are not prepared for a major war with Russia. But Russia is prepared for a major war against us. And I think people in Washington have lost sight of that. There's something else here, too, that we shouldn't lose sight of. We have a problem in this country. It's an infatuation with air power. Air power is the equivalent of sex without consequences. You can bomb or missile attack people on the ground. There's no real response against you sitting in the United States or sitting in Western Europe. Nobody has the air defenses to stop you. You don't really accomplish anything other than alienating and offending people. But it feels good to the politicians in Washington that we're able to do that with impunity. Well, that's worked with Iraq. It's worked in Libya. It works in Africa. It's worked in many places. But it's not going to work with the Russians. And that's the danger, that we are pushing too far. If you stop and recall that when President Trump met with President Putin, he met him on the tarmac at Elmendorf Air Force Base, and parked on either side were all of these modern combat aircraft, F-22s and so forth, or F-1. I don't remember the entire contingent, but they were all modern combat aircraft. And then suddenly, while he was greeting Putin, overhead flew this B-2 bomber with supporting aircraft. Putin smiled and shook his head and walked away with Trump. But this idea that somehow or another we're threatening everyone with the use of this air power, so if you don't do what we say, our air power will destroy you, is very dangerous. Because we're now dealing with powerful states like Russia that can respond, and that war can reach us. In other words, the damage won't be limited to Ukraine. The damage will find its way into Western Europe and the United States. So what's really disturbing is that there's no requirement for it. This lie that the Russians are building up forces for the purpose of marching all the way to Paris is absurd. There's no evidence for that. There's no interest in that. That is a financially, commercially, and strategically stupid idea. The Russians know that. They're not interested in it. They want to settle this thing in eastern Ukraine, but they want to settle it in a way that prevents them from having to refight the whole war all over again in another 5 or 10 years, which is why they won't agree to a ceasefire. And by the way, nobody seems to note that World War I did not end with a ceasefire. It ended after negotiations were held and agreements were reached. And then a date for an armistice, a ceasefire, was set. So we've lost our minds that somehow or another a ceasefire is evidence for a solution, that a ceasefire is evidence for peace. It's not. It's just what it says it is. It's a pause. The Russians are not interested in a pause that will allow their opponents to simply rearm, refit, and go back to fighting again, although that's increasingly unlikely given the very terrible state of Western Ukraine. But nevertheless, that's their position. It's not an unreasonable one. So why not talk to the Russians and then set a date for a ceasefire based on a solution? It's because nobody wants a solution. Nobody wants an end to this for some reason. Now, when I say nobody, does that mean the Germans, the Poles, the Slovaks, Hungarians, the French, the Norwegians, the Danes, all of these peoples want desperately to sustain a war against Russia in Ukraine? I don't think so. But the governments do. And the governments are wedded to this project because if they do anything else, it's tantamount to an admission of failure, a capitulation they can't afford, because that puts them at risk of admitting that everything they've been saying for the last 3+ years is a lie. And it is a lie. Russia never had any intention of moving much further than it already has. How many times have we talked about territory and said, territory is not the issue. The issue is destroying the enemy. And fortunately, thanks to the brilliant generals that run NATO, the Ukrainians have accommodated them and sent tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men to be destroyed trying to defeat the Russians on the ground from what is really a strategic defensive posture. But nobody wants to tell the truth. So if you can't tell the truth, you try to keep this going. And simultaneously, Western Europe in particular, Great Britain right now is very close to simply collapsing financially. We're not far behind in the future. The French and the Germans are in terrible shape. So what makes you think sustaining these provocative acts against Russia is going to improve the situation for these globalist elites? I don't think it will, but I think that's what's going on. And I think Trump has simply signed on for it because he has this mentality that bullying people works. It doesn't. It angers them. That's exactly what he tried to do with Modi in India. And the Indians said, thank you very much. We'll leave your system. We'll join the new one that's emerging.